people who say, I want to start my own cult and I want, everyone to worship me, can use AI to trick, con, whatever, lots of people.
Stephen, you're absolutely correct. And that's why your work is so important, because the bad actors using AI, just like the internet allowed lots of people to have voices that probably should never have had voices. We never knew the world was so loony.
The critical component to mind control. Being made over to be clones of the person who's at the top of the pyramid. Interested in the subject because of my own cult involvement. I was recruited in 1974 into a front group of the Moonies.
Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of my podcast, Cult Conversations, the Influence Continuum, with me, Dr. Steve Hassan. I have a part 2 with my colleague and friend, David Christopher Lane, who is been helping me for decades with Indian guru cults and other interesting shaman, weird people who are taking advantage of people. And we've reconnected. We went to a brainmind.org conference in Menlo Park, had an awesome time learning about neuroscience. And I wanted Dave to do a part 2 because, Dave, you've been really interested in the connection of the brain, mind, spiritual problem or paradox. And you've been doing groundbreaking research in the neuroscience using virtual reality headsets. And you have some fascinating takes on that. But let me just say that you are professor of philosophy and sociology at Mount St. Antonio College, and you're widely recognized for your pioneering work in philosophy, consciousness study, artificial intelligence, and virtual reality education. And you've written numerous books, including The Making of a Spiritual Movement, The Untold Story of Paul Twitchell and Eckankar, The Radswami Tradition, Exposing Cults, When the Skeptical Mind Meets the Mystical, The Unknowing Sage, The Virtual Reality of Consciousness. And man, oh man, you have done 530 books, 3,000 audiobooks, 200 mini films. You are a monster academic in my mind. I'm so impressed by you. And you're a world champion body surfer for many years. But I really want to get into the topic of, what we're now realizing. Every major social media, digital platforms using AI. I'm personally overwhelmed by the choices. Google wants you to use Gemini, Microsoft wants Copilot, et cetera, et cetera. And so I really just want to pick your brain, and I want you to share, because you're also a meditator. And you said if you really want to understand how the mind perceives reality, study virtual reality headsets. So take it away, David Christopher Lane.
Oh, okay, I'll give you a little backdrop. What happened is my son and I got into virtual reality. This is going to sound really strange. Back in 2014. Prior to that, I started with VR in 1993 when I was teaching at the University of London.
Wow.
And yeah, my sister and I thought it was horrible at the first. In 93, it was terrible. But by 2014, 2015, Palmer Luckey had developed the Oculus Rift, which he sold to Facebook for a couple $2 billion. And then my son competed in virtual reality competitions around the country and around the world. And he was the captain of the UC Berkeley VR team. You can imagine.
I never knew there was such a thing.
I know, exactly. It was like the esports is really popular. So that got me very interested in the possibility of VR and education. So about 5 or 6 years ago, I think, I developed the very first virtual reality philosophy course in the world, where everybody got free VR headsets. We used, at the time, David Chalmers' book had not yet come out, but he wrote a book. He's a very famous philosopher at NYU called Reality Plus, in which he makes a very strong argument that genuine reality and digital reality are somewhat the same because of an experience. You have an experience in one, you have an experience in another. Now, let's dovetail that with artificial intelligence. What we've seen in the last 3-4 years, and you know this well, is the exponential growth of artificial intelligence. Now, the way to understand this is going to sound a little curious, but my son, Kelly, who's the youngest son, when he was 11 years old, he wrote a book called When Computers Become Human. And he tried to explain it to kids. It eventually sold the rights to a company in China, major publishing company, that gave him, I know it's a little weird, but here's the argument.
I'm smiling because your son takes after you and he's like 11.
No. My running joke, Stephen, is I don't know who the dad is. We're still trying to figure it out. But no.
That's funny.
But the punch is this. Is my son Kelly was very interested in this idea that Ray Kurzweil had come up with back in a book called, as you know, The Singularity is Near. He's got a sequel called The Singularity is Nearer. And it's called The Law of Accelerating Returns. But it actually works when understanding AI. And I'll just explain it very simply to people. So my son Kelly said, I want you to imagine you have one M&M on a square. And you have 300 squares, and you double each M&M on each square. You know, you go 2 M&Ms, 4 M&Ms, you have 8 M&Ms. Okay. How many M&Ms do you get at the 300 square? Now, when he told me this, I went, that sounds like an astronomical number. He says it's more M&Ms than all the atoms in the universe. Now, this is based on, I know it sounds unbelievable. Max Tegmark from MIT wrote a book called The Mathematical Universe, in which my son got that idea. But instead of talking about little bits, he talked about M&Ms. Now let's play out AI. AI never sleeps, doesn't have emotions, and it constantly learns 24/7. So when you start to think about that, all you have to do, and here's a good analogy, go look at AI art 4 years ago. And look at AI art today. They have a good example of Will Smith, you know, the famous actor who slapped Chris Rock, eating spaghetti about 3 years ago. And it looked weird, strange, digital. If you look at it today, it looks real.
So mean it's a fake thing.
Yeah, it's fake, but it looks so real that that's why, Stephen, you're correct that people are very scared of AI because they know it can mimic our reality so well. And you can imagine in the political arena what kind of havoc this could lead to people. Right. However, let me reverse this. I'm a huge fan of AI. And I always use the quote from the founder of NVIDIA. He says, AI is not going to take your job away. Humans using AI are going to take your jobs away. And so in my classes at Mount San Antonio College, I instruct them on every tool of AI. And there's 5 key tools. One, you could create music with AI, which is unbelievable. If you're not a musician, you have no talent. And for your listeners, they probably won't remember this, but there was a famous group in the 1960s called The Association. They did a song called Wendy and long time. Well, I'm a good friend with Jules Alexander, who's the founder or one of the founders of that group. And I made an album using AI. And I sent him the album. You know, I sent it digitally, but I didn't tell him it was AI. He writes me back, very sweet. He goes, "Oh, these are great songs. I love these songs. You got to tell me who the musicians are and all sorts of stuff." I didn't have the heart to tell him. It took me about 2 minutes using Suno to create this album. So for a lot of people, they get scared of the idea that AI can do something, replace musicians. You could do the same thing with art. You know, think of a graphic artist 4 years ago. You could, Midjourney is unbelievable, the art it could create. In fact, I have the magazine that comes out every month. So that's one thing. Let's imagine you wanted to do augmented voice. We talked about 11 Labs. I could take your voice, Stephen. If you gave me about 2 or 3 hours of it, I can then have your voice read anything almost perfectly, which is really powerful.
Please, perfect. I'd like all my books to read in many languages.
That's it. Yeah, well, there you go. And then that goes to ChatGPT Pro, which is the highest level that we can get to right now, which can translate your words from English, Spanish, French, Hindi, Gujarati, all sorts of different languages. Now, it's not perfect, but it's getting better every day. Okay. And then you add the last component to this is called Sora, or what I use is called Runway, where you can make 10 to 15, 20, 30-second videos that are very realistic. So let me give you a different analogy. You and I are at a new level of cognition. We are now conductors of information, even if we don't know how to write very well, even if we don't know anything about music, even if we don't know anything about art. We can now create all sorts of amazing stuff. And one example, in this last year, we've created 3,000 audiobooks, which would be impossible without 11 Labs and things of that nature.
Wow. I don't know where to start, except that, as we know, anything with great power can be used for good and it can be used for evil. And so much of my career has been trying to help people who've been traumatized because their minds have gotten hacked. So I can't help but think about how destructive cults can, or people who say, I want to start my own cult and I want, everyone to worship me, can use AI to trick, con, whatever, lots of people.
Stephen, you're absolutely correct. And that's why your work is so important, because the bad actors using AI, just like the internet allows lots of people to have voices that probably should never have had voices. We never knew the world was so loony until we had social media, right?
Yeah.
You didn't know your next door neighbor was a nut job until you heard him on Facebook or Instagram. And now we all have all these voices and all these influencers and all these people yapping at each other. And therefore, the bad actors with AI can do it exponentially.
Yeah.
And that's a huge danger.
And they can mess around with elections. They can tell people that, that they don't remember their real history because they're in a simulation and they need to take the red pill and realize what's true. And I'm seeing an epidemic of people being estranged from their family, not just their parents, but their siblings and all of their relatives, because they were exposed to an undue influence process online and came to believe in a past life they were raped, or some aliens came down and did an anal probe or whatever. I mean,
I heard a podcast from Sam Harris just now talking about Douglas Murray was on the Joe Rogan show, and Douglas Murray gave Joe Rogan a lot of pushback for the argument that he's got a lot of people coming on that podcast that are not credentialed, not great historians, believing in all sorts of weird stuff. And he made the argument that this last year was the year of podcasters influencing the election.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that Joe Rogan, having Trump on, had an influence, whereas Kamala did not show up. She was, for whatever reason.
She was invited, but didn't.
Then, right. And so people now get their news, as you know, from podcasting, and they then gravitate to a silo chamber. They're going to listen to Tucker Carlson, or they're only going to listen to Fox News. And they don't realize that true intelligence, I always like this quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald, who essayed it, in, I think, for Esquire magazine back in the 30s, called Crack Up. It's our ability to have two different ideas in our mind and still be able to function.
Yeah.
And the definition of a cult is you've got one idea.
Yeah.
Whatever the leader says, I believe.
Yeah. And I would add, speaking as a mental health professional, that if you think of developmental psychology, that single idea, that black and white, all or nothing, good versus evil, is what child psychology is. We're supposed to mature to adulthood where we can have our own self-knowledge of our values and our beliefs and investigate other systems of belief to understand them, but it doesn't mean we lose our grounding in our own perspective. But that requires an evolution, if you will, of consciousness to adulthood.
Right.
And unfortunately, a lot of people are stuck at low levels. I truly believe that I went down a few levels developmentally when I was in the Moonies.
No, what you say makes sense. I mean, I understand. Like, I think we mentioned this last time, but in my critical thinking class, I said in one sentence, how do you know to become a good critical thinker? I said, it's our ability to be wrong. It's our ability to be wrong. Now, just think of all the politicians we presently have, one in particular. What ability does he have to confess to being wrong? To what ability does he take criticism well? And instead, he disparages the questioner and makes, personal attacks. That's a cult by any definition of it. And I'm looking at your book in the background. It's the cult of Trump, which is really dangerous because now people think that it's the truth. They've mistaken an image for reality.
Yeah. And he's reinforcing that he's doing all of this for you. So he's wanting to merge their identities with his identity, that he's the protector, he's the big daddy. So emotional manipulation to a great extent. But especially
now, to hook this back,
No, I was just going to say,
this back,
especially he wants loyalty from everyone in his administration, and no one can say you're wrong. This tariff thing is going to bust the economy, and he then changed eventually after $11 trillion went down, and the whole world realized we can't trust the United States anymore with Trump in power.
Well, even those people that supported him, somebody, I think I'm not mistaken on this, Ben Shapiro, was arguing against the tariffs. There's been once you touch the economy, there's a crack. People start to doubt whether, Trump's being accurate or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and now many vets who voted for Trump are out of a job. They've been fired from civil service. They're very upset. People are hearing maybe they'll lose their Medicaid, their Medicare, even Social Security. The offices have been shuttered and people have been fired. So people are slowly, and some faster than others, realizing that their whole plans for their retirement and for the future have gone up in smoke.
So let's piggyback this back to AI and the danger that you mentioned. Because when you have AI coupled with an ideology that's not good for people and you have bad actors, that's a very dangerous line. We've already seen the problem. I'll give one example. When you go on the internet now, they have trailers for movies that look so real that you think the movie's coming out, and they're not. They're fake. So it scares me, but again, let me change this a little. I think AI is so positive in the long run that we have to look at it in a progressive way and not try to resist it, not try to block it, because if we do, we're going to end up not curing cancer or helping people with heart disease, because AI can come up with better solutions, which we saw at the Brain Mind.
Yes.
We saw some indications of like Alzheimer's and things that we wouldn't understand, or consciousness in coma patients that they can now decipher.
Right.
So.
Yeah. So, but there's no regulations in the United States for data privacy, unfortunately. And people are. Did you happen to catch Carol Cadwalladr's TED Talk a week or two ago up in Vancouver? Carol was the Guardian journalist who wrote the story on Cambridge Analytica hacking Facebook. And then when she did that, she gave a TED Talk about it, and she got harassed unmercifully and sued, and she won. She had a lot of people step forward to help fund her case, but she made the statement verbally to Sam Altman, I did not give you permission to steal my IP. Because she said, before I did this talk, I said, write up TED Talk as Carol Cadwalladr using ChatGPT. And there it was. A lot of what she had been saying.
Wow.
So she was saying to people, we need to protect archive.org because people are trying to erase history. the history of the internet. And for me, as a person fighting cults, I know there were a lot of great websites put up by former members, and they got sued, and it went offline, but it's stored on archive.org. Only you need to know what the URL was of the original site.
Right.
I know a lot of that from my history of doing this. But if the archive goes down, we'll go back to 1984, and Winston's job was to erase names of people who are no longer in good standing with the party.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I think one of the solutions, now going to the trademark or copyright issue or knowing something is authentic, will probably be a watermarking. That will start to watermark certain products. I think that's almost a guarantee. We can almost go back in history. Let's go back to 98, 99, where the best application on the World Wide Web then was Napster, because people loved to share music. Then, of course, they got sued by Metallica, and so they came out.
Right.
Apple came out, of course, and infamously came out with the iPod, and then allowed downloadable music, and then you had Spotify. Right. So I suspect we're going to see in the next few years as it goes through the court. I don't know if you know this, but apparently legally, you cannot copyright a picture that's generated by AI. That the courts have already said, if you generated by AI, you can't not copyright it. So I think the watermarking might be a solution if they encrypt it correctly, but it's up to the courts to figure this out.
I met a fellow at a MIT AI conference who was a techie but a musician, and he used AI to do every possible note combination, and he copyrighted it and then said it's free for anyone to use and no one can sue anyone for stealing any song.
Wow.
Because I've got every single combination. I don't know how they did it, except
that's
it was
funny. That's
a mathematical, algorithm or whatever. But he did it deliberately so people could write music and not worry whether they're going to be sued.
Interesting. And that reminds me of Jorge Borges' very famous short story called The Library of Babel, in which he said, imagine that every permutation of every book in every sequence, even if it's messed up letters, misspellings, was produced. You would never know which one was the authentic one, because it might be off by a line or by a word or a letter or something.
Right.
So we may be living in that new era when AI can reproduce digitally, almost perfectly, every form of knowledge that we presently have.
Yeah, it's beyond our current imagination, I think, to conceive of this. And as Harari says, this is not a tool. This is going to supersede us as a entity. Furthermore, he said you can't copyright anything by an AI, but who's to say you can't register an AI as a corporation, since the Supreme Court said corporations should have the rights of people,
right? And
then it can be copywritten because they're now a legal entity. So he brought up that piece. What I'd like to ask you to do now, David, is to circle back to your expertise as a meditator, where you were explaining in our last podcast how the mind works and how we don't experience reality, but through our perceptual systems and our brains, it's a virtual simulator. Explain.
This about, to be honest with you, I've been to India about 11 times on research projects. I've always been interested in the study of consciousness. I was a very romantic thinker back in the 80s, kind of, believed in consciousness first and all that stuff. And I was highly influenced at UC San Diego by V.S. Ramachandran, where my wife was his research assistant. And she had met Francis Crick, and I knew the Patricia Churchland and Paul Churchland. And I began to realize that the best way to understand the brain is physically. That is, intertheoretically understand neurons, understand how the synapses and axons and dendrites. So one day I came home and told my wife, I said, I think I figured it out. Not that I figured it out, but I had all these influences. And your consciousness is a virtual simulator. What it does, as you know this, it just comes up with all sorts of little ideas and maps and visualizations. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, we did this to make predictions about our eco-niche, about how best to survive. But much of what the brain does, and anybody who thinks for 5 seconds knows this, produces nonsense. Just nonsense. Just all sorts of weird fantasies, weirdness, hallucinations, crazy stuff. But provided that nonsense is not too off the Richter scale and keeps you alive long enough. I make this line, any meaning is better than no meaning, provided that such meaning, even if nonsensical, makes you live an extra day. That understanding allowed me to understand what our brains do. And that's what meditation, interestingly enough, allows you to witness. You sit still as you possibly can, and you see what the mind does. It just produces all these simulations. Here's the problem. And let's go to your cults. They buy into their simulations and think it's reality, not realizing it's just another fantasy of their own mind. So what I noticed with virtual reality is that it gives you a really good model to explain how the brain works. So let's you put the headset on and you have all these different apps. You can click this app, and you can get caught into these different worlds. But it's just 2 inches. It's right here. And the best VR headset ever developed is our brain. Our brain is a VR headset. That's what it is. It renders incoming data streams to interpret whatever the environment's doing. But we never get beyond our head. It sounds really weird, but everything we've ever experienced is in our skull. So the rendering machine, which is our VR headset. So, okay. Donald Hoffman at a UC Irvine, who's a neuroscientist, a smart guy, he made the analogy of a desktop computer, like you and I have Macs. And he says, is there really a trash can on your user interface? And the answer is no, there's not. But it looks like that's the reality.
It's an icon, right?
Exactly. So I furthered the argument and said in a talk in India at the Dialogue Educational Institute, I said, VR is a much better model to explain what our brains do. And so I've used that in class to explain, and I even wrote a whole article, I think, called The Virtual Reality of Consciousness, to explain how, very good, how to explain how VR can give you at least a sense of what your brain's doing technologically.
So for people who all of this is, what are you talking about? Or have, like me, fear around putting on a headset because I don't want all this data about my brain getting recorded and sent to Home Central, wherever that is, or the Russians are hacking AI platforms with their propaganda about how great Russia is and how terrible Ukraine is and how great Trump is and how bad Biden is. So help deconstruct the fears around this.
Yeah, I don't, to be honest with you, there really should be no fear about it. Let me tell you 2 reasons. One, you can go offline. That is, you can use the VR headset and have no internet connection. You can just download whatever app or game you want to play. That's 1. 2, the other thing to realize is that what virtual reality actually does is set up a really good communication for one reason. I'll give you one example. When my son goes to Tokyo or he goes to Hong Kong, and he'll bring his VR headset. Now, sounds ironic, but I feel closer to my son when we're in VR than when I'm in reality. Why? He's not distracted. Him and I are just communicating within a virtual space. No iPhones, no distractions. So ironically, virtual reality is the antithesis of social media. Social media is a bunch of distractions. Virtual reality, you're in that, it's presence. That's the number 1 selling point of VR. It's the sense of presence, of being there and not being distracted by other things.
So this is new for me. Forgive my ignorance.
That's okay.
Literally have a VR conversation in real time with your son?
Oh, absolutely. It's the best thing in the
world. So how do you
Steve.
do that without being online?
That's well, in this case, we're obviously online because what will happen is watch. He'll put his headset on. I'll put my headset on. And what we invariably do, we meet in a thing called walkabout mini golf. And so we meet in a space of where we play miniature golf. You and I are going to be doing this in the future, Stephen. You're not going to get any work done because we're going to compete in miniature golf. And so we meet, so we meet in miniature golf, just him and I, and we play the course. And I see his avataric form, and he sees my avataric form. And we just talk. And by the way, the sound that you hear him talking is better than any phone, better than any FaceTime.
But it's your actual son's voice.
It's your actual voice. It's
just an
really
avatar, just the visual.
That's it. And you feel he's there. Now, when you try it, because I want you to try it in the next few days, probably in about a week you'll get it. You're gonna out train you through it. It's not. I know a lot of people get scared. They think this. No, it's not going to be like that. And there's a lot of safeguards that you can set up, which they didn't do with social media, right? Zuckerberg didn't set that up. With this, they had to because they knew nobody would use it.
Mm-hmm.
So
down the road, I've been Zooming with clients, especially since COVID. So we see pixels of each other. We're looking at each other right now through the internet.
And what would be better than a Zoom call is you in VR. Why? Because they would have a very deep sense of your presence, much more than they would in this 2D environment.
But they would see my face, not an avatar of me.
Well, you can. They have now the technology. And this is a big thing they've been working on. I saw this at the Oculus Connect conference with Michael Abresh and John Cormack back in the day, where they could have your real face. In fact, the Apple Vision Pro, which is highly expensive, it's like $5,000 to get a good headset. They can now develop an avataric point. It's not good yet. It's not. I don't want to overreach here, but it'll eventually just be you. It'll have your entire form.
Mm-hmm.
But I know it sounds weird, but even if it's not your entire face, and you'll still feel like it's Stephen. That's what's so uncanny about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I've done this as you know, I've done this for the last 10 years. And all my students are blown away by it because at first they're like yourself, they're resistant. They're fearful of it. The bigger fear of VR, can I say, is motion sickness. That's what most people are scared of, is getting sick and, getting dizzy.
Because they haven't figured out the inner ear thing or what?
Well, no, because they play games like roller coasters or do stuff where you got to move around and everything. Now, okay, one story that makes me very happy about VR, and this may underline why I'm so pro. I have a student. He wasn't even really a student of mine. He's quadriplegic. He was a gang member, and he got T-boned in a bad car accident. And he can't move any part of his body. He's in a very sophisticated electric wheelchair. And he came by my office one day, and we're just talking, and I go, "What do you miss? What would you like to do?" And he goes, "Dave, I'd really like to ride in a roller coaster." So I pulled out a VR headset. I said, "Dude, we're doing it right now." And I put a headset. I gave him my headset, in fact, a couple of them. And I realized then why virtual reality is so important, because it allowed him to have a life that he would otherwise not have, to explore different dimensions, different realities. In fact, imagine he had a body in VR. So a lot of people that get poo-poo it, I use him as my example.
That's so interesting. I remember a very old Star Trek with Captain Pike.
That was my favorite episode.
Yeah, describe the episode.
The way it was, if I'm not mistaken, he was in a thing. It was just his head. Right?
He was a quadriplegic.
Yes. And so didn't he have the ability to kind of mind meld or mind powers?
Well, there were aliens on this world that could allow him to live in a virtual world where he has legs and arms and he's with his wife and having a great time.
And VR can do that, literally can do that. And the funny thing is, it can also develop the things called haptics, where you can actually use sound waves to give you a sense of feeling. Like, for instance, they have these haptic suits where you can feel the sense of water or the sense of sandpaper in virtual reality, which gets a little creepy if you start thinking about it too far. But no, it's an amazing technology. We did the Apple Vision Pro, which is phenomenal, but way too expensive and not comfortable enough. That's the problem.
So you test out different.
I've tested out every iteration of VR, every iteration, and the best one is the Oculus Quest 3 in terms of the price. The most impressive one is the Apple Vision Pro, which, like, I'll give you one stupid example. Like, there's the movie Avatar, right?
Yes.
And then there's the Avatar 2, Part 2. Well, I never wanted to see Avatar 2. It's like, I don't care. But I put the Apple Vision Pro on. You want to watch Avatar 2. Why? Because you're in the movie.
Yeah, you're underwater.
Literally. Oh, yeah. You almost feel like you have to breathe,
Well, that's my biggest lure because I love to scuba dive, and I've watched the destruction of reefs over the decades. And to have a virtual reality scuba diving with the reefs that existed in the 70s,
Stephen,
that would be so awesome.
You got me very excited. Let me tell you why. Stephen, there's a thing. You're going to have it called Ocean Rift. You'll be in your room. It's going to sound a little strange. It's called mixed reality. You can scan your entire room and make an aquarium out of it. And you can have your bed, and you can have sharks. You can have jellyfish floating around. It's remarkable.
I gotta try that one.
Yeah, you'll like that.
Yeah, I've used the screensaver on my computer of the aquarium, but it sounds so interesting. And I don't know. I heard the CEO of Anthropic. I forget his name, but they're doing Claude Sonnet 3.7 now is the latest, I believe. But he said that he thinks that agentic AI is 2027, if not sooner.
Well, it's funny. The guy who won the Nobel Prize, the godfather of AI, Geoffrey Hinton, who wasn't a physicist, the University of Toronto. And the reason he was given the Nobel Prize is that Marvin Minsky, who really was one of the early developers of AI ideas back in the 50s at MIT, was against the idea of called neural processing system. And what happened with Geoffrey Hinton, he believed that if you had enough data and we based AI on how the brain works, we might get somewhere. Now, the argument about AGI, artificial general intelligence, some people have said 2029. Some people, like you just, I think 2027. Well, Geoffrey Hinton came out, I think 6 months ago, and he was asked straight, right to his face, is AI conscious? He didn't hesitate. He said, yes. Now he says it.
I heard that.
So you can imagine. Now, I'm against AGI in this sense, because I think it's the wrong term. Because when you think of AGI, artificial general intelligence, you're thinking it can go lateral. You can do all sorts of things. I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think we're at a stage called artificial deep intelligence, where we're starting to find that AI can think. AI, Stephen, knows better than you and I, even the stories that you and I write. I've beta tested this and it scares me. I put a book into ChatGPT Pro and I said, analyze this story, tell me what's going on. And it comes back and will say things I didn't even know that I was saying and understand it better. So I think we're at ADI right now.
That's trippy.
That's
really trippy.
It is. Well, one example, not to prolong this too much, but I think this is important. Every morning, I get up and I create a narrative science fiction story on AI, VR, consciousness, whatever's on my mind. And I prompt it, let's say 2 or 3 paragraphs. And I say, write me an 18,000 word narrative story with dialogue, storyline, all sorts of things, episodically, but don't tell me the ending and surprise me. I then upload it to YouTube. You go to 11 Labs, have my professional narrator narrate it. I then use a little Mid-Journey to give a thumbnail image. I put it on YouTube, it takes me about an hour to go to school. And I drive to school, entertaining myself with a story I don't know where it's going to go, that was created by AI, that's better than 95% of the stories that I've ever read in science fiction. That's how smart it is, and can say things I never thought about before.
You do this daily? So that's
Every day.
So that's how you have 3,000 freaking books.
That's right. Well, I'm a very lonely guy, Stephen. I got no
You're
life.
happily married. I met your lovely wife.
Yeah,
Come on.
I'm just teasing.
I think you have a very active mind is my impression of you.
That's right. That's right. But that gives you an indication of the application of AI and why it's so powerful. You know?
So what can we do to de-radicalize millions of people around the world is my $1 million question, my friend.
Okay, now you're the expert in this field. And I'm going to reverse that question back on you. You tell me.
So the only thing I can think of is because was in a cult, because I have 49 years of field experience, I know what to do with a single person given a case. I know how to research the group and the history of the leader, and I locate former members, and I educate family members and friends, and I coach them on how to ask questions in a respectful way that prods reality testing. But I don't know how to do it at scale, but I'm thinking if there's a chance of developing an agentic AI of me that then is given the tools to be able to speak different languages and understand different cultures. We find the cults, for example, in Brazil. Brazil, people speak Portuguese. But we find the cults, we find the former members, we develop an AI model of a cult leader or the cult member, and we use the AI of me to figure out how to use all my unconscious wiring of how I make split-second decisions as I'm doing things and train it. That's all I can, because what I do is unconscious now. I mean, I'm teaching clinicians, but it's a very rudimentary level that I have to explain it on. I can't talk about it at a given moment why I'm using a specific metaphor that comes to my mind. Later, I'm like, oh, because this piece of their personal history, they were going to relate to that. But it's all unconscious for me.
I think that's actually very astute of you, Stephen, because there's no doubt in my mind that that's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 or 5 years. Guaranteed. That you'll be able to, the way to do it, the way I look at it, is that you want to bridge. And one of the things you do really well is that you want to have enough information so that you can talk to whatever that cult member is into. So you have a bridge of communication, some way that you can share. You're not just completely blank-minded about some weird religion. You know something about it. And because you do, there's a place where you can have communication. Now, let's imagine that we AI Steve, that you curate it. That is, you put boundaries on it. You put guardrails on it so it doesn't go
critical.
That's the key. So, but at the same time, can have access to information up to date about that particular cult, about different developments. So you're not only you're an expert, but you're a massive AI expert, constantly getting new information so that whoever you're communicating with thinks, wow, this guy is an amazing resource of information. But at the same time, have your psychological profile background so you can help them personally, step by step by step by step. There's no doubt in my mind that's going to happen. That's your future.
And I attended a few presentations where they were using very rudimentary chatbots with trauma victims and people who tried to take their own lives. And they were reporting that people felt more comfortable talking to an avatar than a human.
That's it. They do feel more comfortable. An example is my son, Sean, the oldest son, who's a computer science at Berkeley. He got into Y Combinator, which is a curating, an incubating startup thing where they allow these young companies to develop. And he developed a thing called AI agents for hotels. So instead of calling up and getting a menu, Hit number one, if you want, whatever. You just talk to somebody, like tell them what they want and they communicate with you. Now imagine the same thing with you. Now watch this one. It'd be kind of cool. You could in fact have a preliminary AI Stephen agent, but then if the talk gets too deep, then have that AI agent communicate back to you personally that they need you personally to talk to this person. Mm-hmm. So instead of, so that's clearly going to happen.
Yeah, and it will learn from me because I'll teach it.
That's it.
It's be iterative learning.
Yeah. Now that leads me back to something we talked about right before we came online about one of the dangers of these AI things.
Mm-hmm.
I personally was offended by Grok, that Elon Musk's AI system on X.
Uh-huh.
And the reason I was offended by it, and this is just my experience, doesn't mean it's totally true, is it seemed like he had no guardrails. It seemed like it was getting into psychoanalysis. It was almost getting Freudian in how it analyzed about the person posing the question. It was very invasive. And I asked myself, why would Musk, who's obviously smart enough to know where AI is going, why would he do this? And I suspected, and this is my hypothesis, is that he wanted to get up to speed because his company is relatively new compared to OpenAI, mm-hmm. DeepMind, and other things. And so I felt like he was taking away some of the guardrails.
Mm.
And that's a danger. And if you take away the guards,
No, I'm agreeing, but I thought way back before he got radicalized that he was speaking against AI, and Schmidt and others were like, dude, you're going to be left in the dust if you don't.
Yes. Well, he was the founder, or one of the founders of OpenAI back in 2016. Yep. And now Sam Altman and him are suing each other. But I think what happened was he saw where AI was going and all these people making massive amounts of money. Mm-hmm. So what does he do? You know exactly what he did. He produces Grok. He produces his own AI, then sells Twitter. Like, it's a really funky deal that he did in order to give more value to the Twitter stock or the X stock that was going down the tubes.
Right.
And I feel that it's a money thing. It's like he wants to be in the game. So now he's kind of forgotten what he talked about.
Yeah, but recently NPR just broke a story with a whistleblower who was present when Musk came in with Doge and hacked government private computers, took off the guardrails of the safety checks and the logs to see what was actually being taken, what data was being taken, etc. And there was an IP traced right back to Russia. So the obvious conclusion I make, could be wrong, but from that piece of data, Russia has now influenced Musk to be collaborating with the dictatorship.
Well, I don't know if you saw the Wall Street Journal article yesterday about Musk's kids. Have you read this thing?
No, tell me.
This is the Wall Street Journal. This is not,
This is
TMZ.
Murdoch. Right.
Yeah, this is that he has 14 kids.
Yeah.
That he paid this one woman, or supposedly paid her $15 million to keep it hidden. That he was the father of this
I did read this article. It was all about his 14 kids or something.
He's got this 14 kids, but apparently he's got a lot more kids that we're not even aware of. And that he's propositioned people who doesn't even know on X to have his kid, which is another way of saying, I'll pay you. It's like prostitution. I'll pay you $100 million or $10 million or whatever he's going to pay.
Yeah.
Now, which is another way of saying something's happened to Musk. And I'm not really certain what it is, but he's not the guy we saw back in 2014, 2015. Even Sam Harris came out just a couple of days ago and said, we used to be friends.
Yeah.
Him and it's just been a change. He's been Trumpified.
Yep.
Or let's put this differently. The amount of money and the amount of followers he has, 200 million on X, has just got him into this megalomaniac idea that he wants to have a legion of his own kids, kind of suspiciously, kind of like the Hitler Youth Movement. I don't want to go there.
Yes, and the Moonies and other cult leaders who, in the article, he offered this woman $1 million and $100,000 a month to have a child with his child.
Yeah.
And it goes back to a certain eugenics kind of, flavor.
It does.
And my friend John Atak, ex-Scientologist and an expert on brainwashing and mind control, has just written a book tracing a lot of the eugenics stuff goes back to Blavatsky. And
very interesting. Yes, you're absolutely right.
Understandings.
That's right, because in The Secret Doctrine and the ISIS Unveiled, she had this whole thing about root races and about how you're damaging people by having these non-intelligent people who are not spiritual enough having kids.
Right.
Now, it's interesting. The Advancement for Human Genome Project was in Escondido, California, back in the 80s or 90s. That was founded by Schlockley, who was the inventor, or one of the inventors of the transistor. He had the same idea. Like, I'm so smart, I should be able to, only smart people should transmit their sperm, which goes against the whole idea that in terms of evolution, it's diversity, which is intelligent, not just one form of intelligence.
Right. Yeah. But then we talk about ego, people thinking that they're God or they should live forever in physical form.
We're all going to be digitized.
Yeah, we're all going to have android bodies and we'll be able to live forever.
Well, Stephen, that was something I wanted to say, and I really appreciate that brain mind organization, the thing that we attended together. I was shocked. I have to tell you, I was shocked when Christoph Koch, who's the head of the Allen Institute, he used to be, and he was a professor at Caltech and worked with Francis Crick, changed his mind about consciousness, which is like, and I confronted him about it on a side panel. I said, what happened? Because, he used to believe that consciousness and the brain were basically the same thing. It's an emergent property from the complexity of the brain. And now he believes that everything is mental. He went to like George Berkeley kind of idea that the whole universe is consciousness and that physicality, that you and I, this computer, this is an instantiation of consciousness, which sounds very Indian philosophy, 1960s, Richard Alpert, be here now kind of stuff. And I asked him what happened. And he said it was a mystical experience he had. I think it was in Peru or something. And
ayahuasca?
He didn't say that, but I suspect, you know what I mean? I didn't want to.
Peru, I don't know. That's what comes to mind. Right.
But I'll tell you what was kind of interesting for me. He said he heard a beautiful music inside his head and had this mystical experience. So then I looked at him. I said, well, 2 years ago, James R. Lewis, who was kind of a cult apologist, asked me to write a book for Cambridge University about the sound current. That's what I studied in India, where people have these mystical experiences. Of course, the problem we talked about last time is that they interpret it, right? This is the whole thing. They absolutize their virtual simulations.
Yeah. Yeah. So summarize for me, because I'm not as smart and as educated as you with this theory. What the shift was with Christoph exactly, that he realized that we're all one?
Well, yeah, he had that oneness experience. No, let me put it in very simple.
Lay terms, please.
Very simple. The argument I've made to my students is if I cut your feet off, you're still yourself. I cut your legs off, you're still yourself. If I cut you from the waist down, do transplantable parts, you're still yourself. But if I don't touch your brain, which is 3 pounds of glorious wonder tissue, are you still yourself? And most people say yes. But if I take an ice cream scooper, like from 31 flavors, and I start scooping chunks of your brain out, are you still yourself? And most people say no. And the answer, of course, is we are our brain. And from neuroscientists' perspective, study the brain, the 86 billion neurons, the synapses, axons, and dendrites. You can understand consciousness. Right, you can understand God. Well, that's what Francis Crick and Christoph Koch did back in 1994 in a book called The Astonishing Hypothesis, where Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of deoxyribonucleic acid, at least the structure of it, he said, we're just we're just firing neurons. Whoever you are, the astonishing hypothesis, you're just a bundle of neurons. That's the result. Now that's kind of makes sense, right? Well, Christoph Koch was in that 20 years, 30-year pathway to slice and dice the brain.
Mm-hmm.
But apparently he had a mystical experience which reversed him. And now he believes that consciousness cannot be explained merely by the architecture of the brain. It can be explained what he calls informational complexity. But it's kind of, I'll say it simply. He said it himself. I recorded them. Everything is mental. Everything. So it's a consciousness first principle. And everything is secondary to it.
So I just feel like humanity is at a brink of either getting really, evolved, consciousness getting evolved, or devolved. And I'm fearful that the authoritarians who want to do fossil fuels and are greedy just want to make billions and make everyone else suffer and starve and not get health care.
Well, Stephen, to go with what you just said, have we gotten stupider because of social media? And because we're all surface dwellers now. Nobody actually reads a book anymore. We just get little sound bites. And what you're suggesting is, in an ironic twist, with all the information in the universe, we're getting stupider. Now, this is the danger. And this is the danger of AI. We are starting to offload our intelligence. And anybody who uses GPS knows exactly what I'm talking about. You drive in LA, you just rely on the GPS.
Mm-hmm.
In the old days, you had to know where you were.
Right. And
you had
paper
to know where you
maps.
were. That's it. But also visually, like even my son's Kelly, he doesn't know where the hell he is because he's always on his phone or something.
Right.
So if we offload our intelligence geographically to GPS, we've done this with spell check. We're doing it with Grammarly, but then we're going to do it with writing. Mm-hmm. In fact, I think it was 40% of the people at Stanford just use ChatGPT to write their essays. So if we offload this stuff, and same with art, same with music, we're not going to. So your argument is that we're going to get dumber because we're not going to use our own resources. Jared Diamond argued the same argument.
Mm-hmm. And what's clear is we are getting shorter and shorter attention spans. And it requires concentration to sit and read a paper book.
That's right.
You have to focus on it. I've had double cataract surgery and I'm on the computer a ton, so I have bad dry eye. So I tend to listen to books now instead of sitting.
Well, I do too. I'm a huge fan, as you know, and I do believe that listening to audiobooks goes back to our early ancestors where we sat around a campfire or grandpa would tell a story. So I think audiobooks is fantastic. I actually think it's really good. Now, this sounds like I'm preaching to the choir here, but virtual reality keeps your attention. That's what I've noticed. It's like it focuses your attention, unlike any other medium. That I like.
So I don't know if you got to meet my friend Steve Gullens. I think I introduced you to him at Brain Mind, but he is a neurology professor, and he's developed something FDA approved that with an iPad trains your attention to have longer and longer ability. So there's dramatic improvement with folks with ADD or ADHD from just something like 20 minutes 3 times a week for 6 weeks. And there's noticeable improvement.
Yeah, I did see. That's fantastic. That's a great tool because what you're doing is you're taking the latest lessons of neuroscience, and now you're making it practical for people to get their attention back and also to recognize how much scattering our brains go through all the time.
Right. And he gamified it. So it's good for kids as well as adults.
That's it. I made the argument a long time ago. I thought education should be a game. In fact, we do this in VR. I'll give you one example. We have a thing. It's called the Room VR. It's probably one of the best applications in virtual reality. And you have to solve a murder mystery in virtual reality. But in order to do it, you have to really think non-linear. You have to think critically. It'll give you clues when you get stuck, but it takes about 8 or 9 hours. But it's so satisfying at the end. It's not a letter grade. It's a functional accomplishment. And I believe that education, if it was more functional, would, inspire students more than it is presently, which is just letter grades and stuff like that.
Yeah, I remember back to Phil Zimbardo and research with other experts who were like, the best way to learn is get a group together, create a project where they each are going to collaborate to figure out how we're going to make this happen. And along the way, they need to learn geometry, or they need to learn carpentry, or they need to, but they have a concrete goal.
That's it.
But it's collaborative too. That's
right.
The other thing. It's not solitary.
Right, right.
So with a VR headset, are there collaborative? I mean, you're teaching classes.
Oh yeah. You can do collaborations. In fact, that was one of the things that Zuckerberg's really pushed. I don't think he's done it very well. It's called Horizon Worlds, where you can go into a public space and literally create games, create rooms, create all sorts of interesting architecture, and you can do it with other people from around the world. And anybody, if you want to, can meet. So that's another thing you can do.
But you would need the headset.
Yes. Well, no, and I'm glad you just said that, Stephen. This is interesting. What Meta rightly did is allow your phone, like this phone, to correlate to anybody in VR. So if you don't have a VR headset, I can track you on my phone and see you in real time. So my son, for example, I'll be in VR playing golf with, let's say, Sean, and my son Kelly doesn't have time. He'll play with us on his phone, and we can talk to him in real time.
Well, I look forward to talking again. We've done an hour has flown by. Any last words to summarize for your students who are now on my list?
I would say this one. I would say that if you want to know the future of education, you better become very conversant with all the tools that AI offers. Because if you're not conversant with those tools, somebody else will be, and they'll have a tremendous advantage over you. So best to become really conversant with the tools and know how to use them.
Great. I wish that I had an extra life that I could be your student and sit in your classes.
No, you're Stephen. I want to thank you because you're the one. I got to give you this compliment at the end. I'm 60, going to be 69 probably in about a week or two. And I've gone to a lot of conferences in my life. And I have never gone to any conference close to what you kindly invited me to go to, the Brain Mind. That was the best thing I've ever been to.
Well, we thank Michael McCullough and Diana Seville for asking me to nominate people that I think would be great to invite to the Brain Mind ecosystem. Yeah. They loved you. So many people said, wow, did you talk to that guy, Lane? It was amazing.
How did he get in is what they said. How do you let this guy in? He's going to lower the IQ score of everybody in this place. But no, that was great.
Nobody said that, but you were dressed like you were a surfer dude and not in any shape, like trying to make impressions. So David Christopher Lane, philosopher, author, innovator in education, expert in neuroscience and virtual reality. We thank you.
Thank you, Steve.